The story begins with a large crowd of people gathered in the courtyard of a kingdom. They were all waiting for a mysterious person who was supposed to appear any minute. The young woman was told to come out because they had already reached their destination. The main thought in the young lady's mind was that today she would marry a man she knew nothing about. The crowd was just crazy that they finally got to see a young woman from the Western Empire. The men also remarked that this young woman was quite beautiful. The young woman herself was staring intently into the crowd, trying to see the face of her precious husband. But when her eyes caught sight of the man who was supposed to be her fiancé, her eyes widened in surprise. Yes, she remembered that fate had brought them together once before. The young man held out his hand and introduced himself. His name was Cassian, the Duke of Turnagain. He said that he was looking forward to meeting her and was glad to see her in his kingdom. The young man added that here they were meeting again. The shocked young girl could only say, you. The only thought in the young girl's mind, whose name was Arna, was that she was going to marry this man and why fate had decided to play such a cruel joke on her. The two young people met on a very interesting day. It was 3 months ago. There was a magnificent ball in the lands of the Western Empire. The invited guests were dressed in fancy dress and masks. They were talking and drinking wonderful drinks. Pleasant music was playing in the hall and was even more conducive to frank conversations. And only one young woman was sneaking up on the window like some kind of intruder. She was not feeling well, so she moved carefully so as not to lose her balance. It was the day of the imperial banquet. But the young girl had forgotten about it, and she had gotten very drunk with the Knights of the Order the night before. She really hoped that she would not be able to attend it tonight, because it would hardly be her dream to attend social events, because on the contrary, she hated them. But Arn's mom had a completely different opinion, because in the morning she found a girl who had not yet woken up from a night of drunken partying and gave her such a beating that she forced her to come here with threats and ultimatums. So the young girl simply had no other choice. Arna decided to find the emperor, bow to him, and get out of this damn party as soon as possible. On top of all this, Arna overheard 2 maidens discussing that they hadn't seen Arna at tonight's ball either. They also said that the Duchess was furious. Arnie also heard that the Duchess was looking for her everywhere, and this time the young girl would not get away with it, because her mother would catch her, and Arna would live in hell for 30 lifetimes. That's why Arna decided to meet with the emperor secretly from her mother, and then ask him what he thinks about it. The young girl looked around the castle and decided that the emperor was on the 3rd floor at that very moment. So the young girl skillfully jumped onto the windowsill and carefully began to climb the wall to the 3rd floor. She had no lack of skill and grace, so very soon she found herself on the balcony. By a strange coincidence, a young man was standing on that balcony. A rustling noise caught his attention, and he turned his head to see what was going on. Arna, when she landed on the balcony after a successful jump, also noticed that she was not alone and decided to see who was there. She stared at the young, handsome man for a minute, and only noticed the blue eyes peeking out from behind the mask. Arna tried to guess who he was, but then remembered that this was the last thing on her mind right now, and she had much more important things to do. The young man decided to help the young girl up and offered her his hand. But Arnie, not paying attention to his offer, jumped onto the balcony and grabbed the ledge and climbed safely to the 3rd floor. The confused young man did not even have time to blink. No sooner had the mysterious lady disappeared from the balcony than several guards came running and asked His Highness what the suspicious sound was. But Cassian replied that nothing dangerous was happening here. The young man also added that a charming stray cat had just run by. He wondered for a minute who it could be. But the young lady sank into the young duke's heart. Meanwhile, Arna was already on the 3rd floor. She looked around carefully and made sure that there was no one in the corridor. That was exactly what the young girl needed to sneak inside unnoticed. One deft move and the young girl was already in the castle. My stomach was unbearably churning. Yesterday's party showed itself. But there was no way back, because the mother would definitely let her skin go. In a couple of minutes, the young girl was already pacing the banquet hall of the imperial palace. She noticed how those present were having a good time. Out of the corner of her eye, the young girl noticed a cute mask lying on the table. For a moment, she thought that it was a stray mask and quickly grabbed it. Arna put it on the go and quickly walked away. One woman looked back to pick up her mask from the table and saw an empty table. She yelled in exasperation. Where was her mask? And that mask had been forgiven a long time ago. When the young girl went to the middle of the hall, she noticed how people surrounded a man. Arna became interested and decided to take a closer look at what was happening there. When Arna came closer, she saw that the man around whom the crowd had gathered was the Emperor of the Western Empire. This was her immediate superior, Sicilian IV, and also by concurrence, her uncle and the Emperor of the Western Empire. Arnie decided that this was the best moment to go say hello to the Emperor and disappear from this damn party. Only she was going to take the first step when she noticed her mother greeting the girl. It was at that moment that Arna heard her mother ask the woman if she had seen her daughter, because she was going to kill her as soon as she found her. And Rosalia Brilt's character was so militant. And this, as no one else knew Arna, who had already felt it on her own skin more than once. The only thing the young girl decided to do after hearing these words was to turn 180 degrees and walk towards the exit as quickly as possible. That was what could save Arna from her mother's wrath. The interlocutor of the Duchess noted that perhaps the Duchess cannot find her daughter because everyone here is wearing masks? But the Duchess replied that Arna had no idea what a masquerade ball was. Arna walked quickly down the corridor, and her mother and her friend followed her. 7 sweats broke out from the young girl. She cursed everything in the world for following exactly her footsteps. The young girl noticed a turn to another corridor and decided to hide there, because to run into Mom in this hot moment. The Duchess complained all the way about her short-lived daughter. Arne hid behind the corner of the corridor and was shaking with fear. She simply asked with all the power of heaven and earth that the mother would pass this turn and not find her frightened daughter. But nothing in this castle could be hidden from the watchful eye of the Duchess. She immediately noticed that someone was there and decided to make sure that her daughter was there. Arna closed her eyes and was afraid to even breathe. Only the thought that she would be caught now and everything would be over was running through her head. Then she felt someone approaching and had already prepared for the worst. But when Arna opened her eyes and got ready to shake off a kind kick from her mother, she saw that she was in the arms of a young man whom she had already met on the balcony. She just had time to ask if they had met before, and the young man put his finger to his lips and motioned for her to behave as quietly as possible. He finally found his magical cat. The Duchess, who turned into this corridor and saw the young couple embracing, began to apologize for disturbing their peace. But the young Duke replied that everything was fine and there was no need to apologize. The Duchess noticed that the young man was hiding the girl with his cloak, so she asked what kind of girl was next to him. Cassian explained that his companion is shy, so she does not want to show her face. And the Duchess smiled and said that in such a case she would not disturb them and went away. Arna was able to breathe a sigh of relief under Cassian's cover. The danger has passed. But she could not understand why he saved her, just like last time. The young man turned to Arna and asked if she had found what she was looking for an hour ago on the balcony. And the young girl just looked at the Duke with a questioning look. Cassian said it looked like the young girl was an uninvited guest here, and she asked why he behaved so calmly in such a case, since he knows that the girl was not invited here. The young man smiled back at her and said he was just curious. At the same time, Arna carefully looked into his eyes and tried to remember whether she had ever seen him in these parts before today. Then she decided that he was a foreigner. The young man explained with a smile on his face that he was simply interested in one charming stray cat. And Arna began to ponder over his words. Why the cat in particular? Then she guessed that it was precisely because she had climbed onto the balcony. From the young man's satisfied face, Arnie understood that she had guessed why he called her a stray cat. But Arna's stomach twisted sharply, and she could no longer chatter. Therefore, the young girl politely apologized and said that first of all she thanked him for his help. Then she added that she would return later and thank him for his kindness. Then Arna took out some coat of arms and put it in the young man's hand. She said she was leaving it as a thank you. Before Cassian could say anything, the young girl turned and, saying that she was in a hurry, quickly walked away. The confused young man just stared at his cat. As soon as Arnie left the corridor, an assistant approached Cassian and asked what he was holding in his hands. The man noticed how His Highness was carefully examining that order. But in his voice, His Highness only said that he did not know for sure what kind of order it was. And in his thoughts, he added that this is probably what a cat's gratitude for help looks like. The aide couldn't figure out why His Highness looked so pleased, and what had happened while he was away. Cassian then asked what was the matter that he was so worried. and the man reported that the emperor was calling the duke to him. His Highness replied that they had no right to keep the emperor waiting. Compared to the Northern Empire where Cassian came from, the local lands are much more fertile and rich. However, all these merits were due to only one man, the master of the sword, Revelgos, the shield of the Western Empire. Throughout history, only 100 men have been awarded the knowledge of a master of the sword. In addition, most of the sword masters were from the Western Empire, who were always loyal to their homeland. Moreover, he saved his country from destruction. Cassian was eager to meet the swordsman in person, who, after so many accomplishments, gave no reason to doubt his greatness. But the emperor only smiled in response, because it was almost impossible to meet the master of the sword. After all, he did not come even when the emperor called him personally. The emperor added that the swordmaster was ignoring even the emperor's orders. Then he added that the boy should not think that he was speaking to the master, he was just that kind of person. The emperor himself almost lost control of his emotions, because he knew that the master of the sword was Lady Arna, and if it was known in other countries, then the Duchess would simply be mad about it. The Duchess was always in a bad mood for her daughter's constant opposition to her marriage. And who would marry a girl who was famous among the people as a master of the sword? A commotion distracted Cassian from his thoughts. He turned his head and saw how the Duchess had found his cat after all, and was dragging her by the ear to give her a good rub. Cassian looked in their direction with a dreamy look, and thought that his wiry cat had been caught after all. The emperor himself distracted him from his thoughts. Cyclone IV proposed to His Highness to return to the conversation about arranging a marriage between their countries. Then the emperor asked if the duke had already liked someone among the local girls. In fact, this ball was arranged so that Sir Cassian would find himself the most worthy match, which would contribute to the establishment of harmony between the Western and Northern empires. The emperor asked if the young man already had someone on his notice, and Cassian said thoughtfully that he didn't even know. His Highness thought for a moment. The girl's status was not important to Cassian. The main thing was that she fit all the criteria. And if she is an interesting person, it will be even better. An image of his cat immediately appeared in his head. Then Cassian took out the order that the girl had given him when she said goodbye, and promised to return and thank the duke. Therefore, he put the order on the table and said that it was a thing of a girl who liked it. The emperor was almost speechless. The coat of arms of the House of Arna lay on the table in front of him. Meanwhile, the duke only added that he would happily marry the young lady to whom this thing belonged. The peak of the military strength of the Western Empire, its savior hero, who was respected by every inhabitant of the country, was Lady Arni, and she was also the head of the Order of the Golden Dragon, on whose shoulders was the entire defense of the country. That's the kind of person Arni was built, the most respected swordsman. But despite all her merits and regalia, this belligerent young girl remained a daughter. Before going to bed, a mother visited her room, who was trying her best to persuade her disobedient daughter to marry a worthy duke from the Northern Kingdom. She thought that at home she remained only a naughty daughter, who was trying to push some man. Arna was wandering somewhere in her thoughts until her mother sternly asked if she was listening to her. The young girl thought that she could just jump out of the window and her torment would be over. Meanwhile, the mother continued to praise her next defendant. The Duchess said that the count from the neighboring empire was simply wonderful, and that he was destined for the girl by fate itself. All her peers have long known the joy of marriage, because love is simply wonderful. The girl furrowed her brows and waited for her mother to talk and leave her alone. But today, their conversation dragged on longer than usual. Therefore, she mentally distorted all her mother's sentences. Then the mother asked her daughter if she knew what nickname she was given in society. Arna asked if he could be a swordsman, and his mother said no. Then the girl assumed that the hero was a savior. The mother again said that her daughter did not guess. And Arna thought more carefully about her nickname. After thinking a little, it occurred to the young girl that she was called a mad dog, and the mother added that not just a rabid dog, but the emperor's rabid dog. Arna thought that sounded pretty good. The Duchess complained to Arna that even if she ever started talking about an engagement, all the boys just ran away because Arna once spanked them all. And Arnie just said that they were all weaklings. That's why they got paid for nuts by the girl. The angry Duchess slapped her naughty daughter on the back because she didn't know how else to talk to her. The Duchess fell exhausted into a chair and said that she only wanted her daughter to be happy, which is why she insisted on getting married as soon as possible. Offended, Arna looked at her mother and tearfully asked if a woman's happiness consisted only in marriage. The mother replied that, of course, every woman has her own happiness. The mother did not know what other arguments to give, so she simply told Arna to live as she knew. But her heart bleeds when she sees how her daughter cannot find love. Arnie looked at her mother and repeated the word love in her mind, but she didn't say anything to her, and it didn't resonate in her heart. A word as a word. But the mother decided to bring her conversation to the end and informed her daughter that a suitable partner had already been chosen for her. The emperor himself took care of it. Confused, Arna shouted, "Who else do they want to introduce to her?" And the mother informed that her fiancé's name is the Duke of Turnagain from the Northern Empire. The Duchess also said that if rumors are to be believed, he is the first groom in the Northern Empire. Every lady would be lucky to marry such a rich, handsome man. And Arna simply exploded with emotions. She cried out, how dare they marry her off to a foreigner? And the mother shouted back that no one in their country wanted to marry Arna. That disobedient daughter did not even want to listen to her mother's arguments and shouted that she would not marry a man she had never even seen for anything in the world. The mother said that who would marry her if not this young man? And she calmly added that her daughter should try to just meet him, and that way they would understand whether they fit each other or not. The Duchess also added that the ladies would be dazzled by his beauty, and isn't it a blessing to be married to such a handsome man? But Arna only angrily shouted for her mother to stop this chatter. That was the end of the conversation. But every day, at the right opportunity, the mother constantly reminded Arne that this union would be simply incredible for everyone, both for the countries and for the young people themselves. And a week passed, and the mother did not stop telling what a skilled knight the Duke was, and he also came from a noble family. And when 2 weeks of these endless persuasions had passed, the mother very much begged to fulfill her last request and marry that Duke. Arne no longer had the strength to argue every day. On the same day, Arne agreed to look at her fiancé only so that the annoying mother would get away from her and not bother her daughter with talks about that damn Duke. On the day of the examination, thoughts in Arne's head were just raging. She could not realize that she would marry a foreigner, and that too in another country. She lived alone and was happy until today. The mother could not stop and constantly told them what a beautiful daughter they had, and how these clothes fit her, and what beautiful jewels complemented her fabulous image. The mother drove her daughter because she thought that the Duke of Turnagain was already waiting for them. But Arna looked at her mother with a disbelieving look, and she had no desire to go to this betrothed. In Arna's head, which amused the young girl at least a little, she thought that she could easily make that Duke refuse to marry at all. The maid informed the ladies that the meeting with the Duke would take place in the reception room, in this very room. Arna looked around and began to examine the Duke's beautifully decorated room. Arna displeasedly asked her mother if she had to accompany Arna here as well. The Duchess replied that her father and the Duke would soon be here. Arna thought for a moment that what she came up with would be complete suicide for her. But the prospect of marrying a stranger was even less appealing. The Duchess chatted cheerfully with the maid, praising the local interior, and the maid informed that the Duke was personally furnishing the entire castle. Arnie went to the window and decided that she simply had no other way out. Because from minute to minute, His Highness will appear here, and her will come to a final end. The young girl opened the window and cautiously looked at her mother and maid. They did not pay attention to the girl and just talked. Arna decided to simply run away from this engagement. The Duchess was the first to hear how a fresh wind blew from the street, and a terrible thought flashed through her head. The woman simply did not want to even think about such a thing. But when the women turned their heads in the direction of fresh air, they saw an empty room and an open window. The Duchess's eyes nearly popped out of surprise and shame for her daughter. The enraged Duchess shouted the name of her disobedient daughter and gripped her fan so furiously that it cracked and broke in two. She did not expect such a reason from her daughter on the day of the examinations. Meanwhile, confused, Arna looked around and looked into the open window. There was no way back. The young girl looked at the garden in which she found herself and thought about what she should do next. Then Arna heard the sound of hooves and turned her head. She saw a carriage approaching this castle. The girl decided to come closer. A moment later, the young girl was already running to the carriage. She decided to use the cruise services for a short time to get away from this cursed place. She ran to the door and grabbed the door handle. A young man inside heard someone trying to get inside the carriage. But when the door of the carriage opened, both young people were shocked by what they saw. They never expected to see each other under such circumstances. For the first few minutes, they just stared at each other in silence. The first to speak was Cassian, who said he was glad to see his stray cat again. They just said the word, "you." Arna heard someone shouting loudly for her to stay where she was and not to move. The young girl turned her head in fear and saw her angry mother. Arnie simply had no choice, and she resolutely climbed into the carriage and sat opposite the young man. Because if her angry mother caught up with her, she would flay her in front of everyone. The young duke just looked at his cat and was amazed by her determination. She attracted him even more when she acted so impulsively. Arnie only apologized for the inconvenience and said that they could go on. The bullets were headed for it. Cassian had only told the young woman that she looked as if she was trying to escape from an unwanted marriage. The angry girl just gave him an incredulous look. His Highness only added that she could use the young man, if, of course, she wished it, and there was some necessity for it. In the head of the confused girl, only questions arose. Why this young man always happens to her at the most dangerous moment and offers his help. Arnie also thought that maybe he was some kind of fraud, and what would he ask in exchange for her request? But Cassian saw the girl's hesitation and said that he did not need anything in return for help. At first she thought he read her mind. Then she guessed that maybe he was just curious and should take advantage of this opportunity, especially if he wasn't asking for anything in return. She thought a little and said that she would agree to accept the young man's help. Cassian just smiled back and said it was just great. The young girl nevertheless dared and asked the young man to pretend to be her young boyfriend just for one day. His Highness smiled with satisfaction and said that he would accept this request as an honor for himself and would gladly play along with the young lady. Meanwhile, the carriage slowly moved away and the young people went on their way. She had no idea where they were going, but she didn't care as long as they were away from her fiancé. After a few minutes, the young girl still wondered where they were going, so she asked the young man about it. And he, without thinking for a long time, said that they were going on a date. Arn's face changed. She looked at the young man with such a look that she wanted to kill him. Her eyes read only the question of what the hell is a date. Cassian smiled and explained that she herself had asked him to pretend to be her boyfriend, which was why they were going on a date. Then the young man added that they should show the whole world that they are a real couple. At these words, Arna thought that it looked like he was already bending the stick to the whole world. But Cassian had his iron argument on this matter. He explained that if rumors spread that she has a lover, then the engagement will definitely be postponed. After listening to all the arguments of the young man, Arna agreed that it was just a brilliant idea, and this is how they could break this silence forever. A satisfied smile spread across the young man's face. When the carriage stopped, Cassian invited the young lady to go with him to the cafe. He ordered a dessert and explained to the girl that it was a very famous dessert in this empire. Cassian noticed with his side vision that the audience had already begun to whisper. These girls already recognized that Lady Arnie was sitting next to him and began to thoroughly wash her bones. Even the girls couldn't recognize what kind of handsome man was next to Arna and decided to just go up and ask. Meanwhile, Arna was looking at the amazing dessert. She was not used to sweets. The young girl was used to hard battles, but not at all to delicacies. So after the first bite, she was so enraptured by the taste that she even closed her eyes with pleasure. The young man noticed that Arna had a piece of dessert left on his lips, so he asked the young woman if she wanted to be informed about her new young man sooner. Arna did not have time to react to this question and give his answer, as the hand of His Highness reached to her lips and he took a piece of dessert that was there. Then he put that piece in his mouth and said that this dessert was truly unsurpassed and that the rumors were not lying, praising it on all sides. Cassian smiled at the young girl and said that this was the quickest way to tell everyone that they were a couple. Those present, who kept their eyes on the young couple, already began to whisper, but Arna was not laughing. She was just raging. The only thing pulsating in his head was the thought of what a jerk he was making in front of everyone present. As they said goodbye at the gate, Arna thanked the young man for today, and he replied with satisfaction that he was glad to help his stray cat. Arnie thought to herself that she even enjoyed their date, even though she thought it would be boring. But most of all, she was glad that now rumors would spread that she had a young husband. Arna happily thanked the young man for his help and said that she would definitely repay him the debt for the service. She was very pleased that the cursed marriage was over. The young man saw that the beauty was very pleased and said that she would have to make a good effort to repay the debt. Then the young man asked Arna why it was so difficult for her to accept just the thought of marriage, although she herself said that she had never seen her fiancé in her life. The young girl thought about it and said that this marriage was just a wishful thinking of her parents, who did not even ask about the feelings of the girl herself. That is why she does not think of getting married. Without thinking long, Arna decided to ask her married sister for advice. The sister thought about it and said that the Duke of the Northern Empire must have already been married, and she is still a virgin. The sister added that there is some trick in this marriage, because a man with such a high status cannot not be married, or he wants to cover up his murky affairs with other ladies with this marriage. After listening to her sister, Arna agreed that the man who agreed to marry her was definitely not in his right mind, and she herself is simply annoyed by the thought that she will have to leave her native land and even more so marry and live with some foreigner, and even in another country. She doesn't even want to think about it. This was the first time in his life that such comments were made about the Duke of the Northern Empire. If only he could hear it, he wouldn't believe his ears. Meanwhile, rumors were already spreading throughout the empire. The girls discussed that Lady Arna had a young man, and besides, such a handsome man that one could not take his eyes off him. The emperor learned about this news from a local newspaper. By the time he read it to the end, he was sweating profusely. Arna was sure that the engagement was broken. The young girl began to calm down and was glad that this story had come to an end. Arna decided to go about her daily business, and as she was heading to the study, her mother called her. The Duchess said with a smile on her face that she admired her daughter's courage to go on a date with a man during her engagement, but she would not mind at all if Arna married him. Upon hearing such news, drops of cold sweat appeared on the young girl's forehead. But the Duchess continued that the Duke of Ternugensky himself informed that the rumors were of no importance to him. The mother smiled, which made Arna uneasy. Then the Duchess said that she did not ask much, just that Arna should choose one of these two young men and marry him. Arna cursed herself, but only one thing was clear: her plan failed. Therefore, the young girl decided to tell the whole truth to her mother's face. She gathered courage and said loudly that she did not want to marry anyone at all. The Duchess looked at her daughter with frightened eyes and sat down in a chair. Terrified, Arna waited for her mother's reaction after her categorical statement. She knew her character well, so the consequences could be unpredictable. But the Duchess, after thinking a little, said the following: "If Arna stays married for 3 months and her husband continues to be unpleasant, then she can divorce him and return home." Such a statement struck Arna. She had at least some hope of returning to her usual activities, even after 3 months. The mother sternly added that Arna would have to tame her temper and live quietly. This was her main condition. And if, after all the efforts, Arna's opinion does not change, the mother will never hint at marriage. When Arna heard the terms of their agreement, 3 months seemed to her to be a rather short period, and she quickly nodded her head in agreement. The Duchess added that fights and murders are also strictly prohibited, because the Duchess will personally deal with the disobedient daughter in such a case. Arna said that although it was difficult, she could do it. Arna's marriage contract was concluded. The news that she was getting married shook the entire Western Empire. It was discussed by almost all residents and printed in all the columns of newspapers. The news concerning the marriage of Lady Arna was also discussed at the military meeting. Someone suggested that when the young lady left, they would lose their fighting power. Someone shouted that His Highness did not think at all about who would inspire the army and skillfully guard their borders. But the Emperor was adamant in his decision. He said that he was going to present Lady Arna with the title of Princess of the Western Empire and treat her accordingly. The Emperor then turned his head to the confused girl and said loudly that Arna was the future of the Western Empire. The young girl was completely confused and did not know how to behave in the status of a princess. She thought that Uncle was bending the stick a little, and now it would be even more difficult for her. At the same time, in the Northern Empire, the court was also discussing the news concerning the marriage of their Duke of Ternuggen. After learning this news, the young girl with green eyes was simply mad. She did not understand what kind of old man the Duke decided to take this step so quickly. After all, Cassian was the son of the Emperor and second in line to the throne. He also ranked first among the most desirable grooms in terms of compatibility. And now, the most cherished dream of every young girl of the Northern Empire, to be next to the Duke in the status of his wife, has simply gone to hell. Cassian's marriage simply spread throughout the Northern Empire. She made such a fuss that only the dumb did not discuss her, and only Duke Cassian himself, who was the cause of such an explosive news, remained as calm as possible. He was in his office doing his daily business. When his assistant came to him, His Highness asked if he had not managed to learn something new, and the assistant guiltily reported that nothing more could be clarified. Cassian closed his eyes and began to recall in detail everything that happened that day at the ball. He was sure that when he asked the Emperor about the Swordmaster, the Emperor was 100% nervous. But maybe it just seemed to Cassian he could not understand. But then he was brought back from Cassian's thoughts to reality by the words of the assistant, who said that he was still worried about something. The Duke told him to say what exactly. The aide said that if rumors are to be believed, Duke Brilkt has a problem child. She has very high hopes, but she has been called a mad dog. The assistant also added that the reason why it is difficult to dig up something about Duke Brilkt lies precisely in this rabid dog. This interested Cassian, and he asked to tell what had been found about this rabid dog. And the man said that one should only say something wrong, and this mad dog will beat everyone to death. After this, His Highness thought even more. He could not even imagine that such a cruel rabid dog and his stray cat were from the same family. His Highness again remembered the beautiful bride, and now it became even more interesting for him to solve this riddle. A smile curled on his face, and the young man was already anticipating his married life with this mysterious girl. His thoughts were interrupted by the news that the airship had already arrived. And it is in him that his bride should arrive. Cassian quickly got up from his chair and decided to immediately go to meet his bride. He was sure that Arna would be very surprised when he saw who would become her husband. When the airship appeared in the Northern Empire, the young girl went over the assumptions in her head, what exactly her husband would look like. Her nanny loudly announced that the airship was about to land, so they should get ready to leave. After a few more seconds, the nanny added that Arna would not think of killing the groom. The young girl looked at the nanny in surprise. She did not expect to hear such instructions. That woman continued that you can't beat people just because you don't like them, and all the more to put your sword into action and swing it all the time. The nanny continued that the girl should smile all the time, speak in a sweet voice, always be graceful and elegant. After these words, Arna wondered what kind of monster the nanny thought she was. A huge crowd had already gathered at the place where the airship was supposed to land. Everyone gathered to see who the first groom in the Northern Empire chose. As soon as they landed, the nanny announced that they had to leave. As soon as the door began to open, the young girl took a full chest of air and dared to take the first step into her new life. There, someone loudly announced that Her Excellency Arnie had arrived. But as soon as the young girl saw her future husband, she almost lost consciousness. Cassian himself was surprisingly calm and said that he was glad to see her in his kingdom. The young man added that he was Cassian Ternugensky, and they met again. But the angry Arnie could not utter a sentence. She only repeated, "You, you." All the puzzles instantly came together in her head. She remembered that day of inspections and understood why exactly she saw him then in the crew. She couldn't imagine how it was possible to make fun of her like that. If she had a sword at hand, she would have cut off this wretch's head without a second thought. The outraged young girl abruptly turned 180 degrees and strode decisively towards the airship. The confused nanny just blinked her eyes. Arnie shouted to her nanny that they were returning home immediately and that she should climb into the airship. The mood of the young girl was decisive, and the nanny understood that this was the final decision. And His Highness and the nanny called the young girl, but she did not think to listen to any of them. Arna decided to break the deal with her mother and return home immediately. But His Highness was not confused. He was counting on this reaction of his bride. Therefore, he quickly caught up with the angry girl and whispered in her ear that she promised to return the debt. After these words, Arnie's eyes almost sparkled. She was already ready to kill this brat, but she heard her nanny scream loudly. She shouted for His Highness to be careful. When the young people turned and looked at the nanny, the woman quickly added that the young lady was very weak. The nanny also added that Lady Arna should be treated like a precious crystal so as not to harm her in any way. After these words, Arna came to her senses a little. The next morning, the frightened maids searched for their mistress. They shouted from the front, asking her where she was, because they asked her not to walk alone. The maid was afraid that Lady Arna was walking somewhere alone in such heat, because her delicate skin could be seriously damaged. And it was not worth allowing such a thing before marriage. Her future husband watched this picture from the window of the castle. He noticed how his future wife was sitting on a tree, and the maids were already falling off their feet, looking for her all over the garden. Cassian was only interested in the question of how such a fragile young girl was able to climb such a tall tree. His Highness had the impression that he had picked up a stray cat instead of finding a wife. He admired his future wife for a few more minutes. The young girl felt a chill run down her spine. She knew this feeling well, and it always meant only one thing. She was noticed. Arna turned her head and tried to get a good look at everything. Her gaze went to the window, from where His Highness had been watching her a few minutes ago. She was sure that she was being watched from there. But in order to understand everything, first you had to get down to earth. Arna deftly jumped from the tree and was down in a few seconds. The young girl managed to hide behind a tree trunk so that the maids would not notice her. They still did not lose hope of finding the young girl and continued to call her loudly. Then the maids decided that perhaps their mistress had gone in another direction and they should look for her there. The maids went to look for her further. As soon as Arnie saw that the maids had moved on, she breathed a sigh of relief and said aloud that they hadn't noticed. But then, she heard someone ask what exactly they hadn't noticed. Frightened, the young girl turned to the side where the voice was coming from and almost fell. There stood her future husband, Cassian. Arnie gathered herself as quickly as she could and asked how long he had been standing here. There was one more question in my head. Why is he so calm? But His Highness answered that not for long. The young girl gave Cassian a displeased look. She was trying to figure out if he had seen her jump from the tree or if he had come later. He noticed that look and with a smile on his face asked if it was true that she liked him very much. Arnie's eyes widened even more. But Cassian calmly explained that if she was looking at him so intently without even blinking, there was a chance she might like his face. The young girl thought about how to answer him and did not come up with one yet. Then simply stumbling along, she began to invent something. Cassian, on the other hand, watched how the young girl was confused and was glad that it was a pleasure to tease her. He then asked what it was like to meet your husband against your will. Arna did not hesitate to answer that it was not so bad. The surprised Duke asked what she meant. The frowning young girl examined His Highness more carefully. She washed away the fact that she did not notice any flaws in him. She decided it might be worth asking frankly if he had someone on the side. They just stared at each other in silence for a long time. None of them dared to say anything. Everyone was in their own thoughts. Cassian decided to break the silence first. He said that the young girl was standing in front of him, although it was obvious to the naked eye that she was thinking about something completely different. Arnie thought a little more about whether she should answer his question honestly, or whether it was still better to behave as a real lady should at first. Then she still dared and asked His Highness where he learned such flattering maenads of conversation, and she advised him not to forget that they are not yet married. The young Duke looked Arn straight in the eyes and said that it was an easy matter to fix. Then the young man extended his hand to the young girl and gently took her hand. At that moment, she first thought of pulling her hand out, but then she wondered what he would do next. Cassian pulled her hand to his face and paused for a moment. He looked at her again and watched her reaction. Arnie just blinked her eyes in confusion. Then His Highness brought the young girl's hand close to his lips, and hot lips touched Arna's tender skin. Goosebumps ran over the girl's skin. He quietly said that it was too late to run. On that day, the Turnujin castle was full of commotion and excessive running around. From the very early morning, the maids ran around all floors without squatting, trying to do everything by a certain time. And there was only one good reason for this. The owner of the castle was getting married today. The tearful nanny could not control her emotions and insisted that Lady Arna was as beautiful as ever today. The nanny was upset that the Duchess did not see how grown-up and beautiful her daughter was now. But Arna reassured the nanny and said that she spoke of the Duchess as if she had given her soul to God. Suddenly, a mother's voice was heard, saying that it was a pity that she could not personally be present at her daughter's wedding. Arna looked at the magic sphere and said that she still sees everything. Arna with her, and her uncle had personally arrived in the Northern Empire to attend the ceremony. Arna almost stopped breathing after such a statement. She was simply shocked by such attention from her relatives and wondered how she would have to deal with all the consequences after the divorce. But while disturbing thoughts were raging in the young girl's head, the maids had already finished decorating the bride and were the last to put the veil on her face. The maid's voice was heard that everything was ready, and in a few minutes, the beautifully dressed bride was already ready for marriage. All the maids couldn't be more pleased with how incredibly beautiful Arna was. The young girl went to the mirror and examined herself from head to toe. She was not in a festive mood, but the maids encouraged her with their compliments and joyful cries. The young girl closed her eyes and thought that she could not believe that she would have to go through all this, although in fact she did not even want to marry without love. The joyful nanny brought a magic sphere to Arnie, and the girl saw her mother there. The Duchess said that her beautiful daughter shines like a star in the sky in her wedding dress. The happy Duchess smiled and said that she congratulated her daughter on the birth of a new family. There were tears of joy in her eyes, and Arna had never seen her mother so happy in her life. The young girl also tried to smile back, so as not to upset her mother, and thanked her for the greeting. She reassured herself that at least her mother would be happy. A lot of people gathered in the wedding hall. They were invited here from different parts of the country, who were very interested in who could conquer the heart of their duke. Only the duke's assistant, who was watching this process from the upper floor, thought intensely why this wedding was happening so unexpectedly. The assistant saw everyone present discussing the wedding. They asked each other what Circassian's chosen bride imagined herself to be. And didn't the duke fall in love with this girl at first sight? There was only one question in the man's mind. What was his duke even thinking about when he proposed marriage to Lady Arna? After all, this marriage now fell like snow on their heads. A loud announcement was made in the hall for everyone to congratulate the bride and groom. The door to the hall opened solemnly, and a young couple entered the hall holding hands. They were incredibly beautiful. There was a whisper in the hall that the bride was a true beauty, and that now it was clear why their duke had lost his head. All the way to the altar, Arna thought only of whether she was doing the right thing. The young man kept his eyes on his bride. He understood what was going on in her heart now, so he decided not to bother her with unnecessary chatter. When the young couple was in front of the altar, the priest announced that first of all he wanted to thank on behalf of the newlyweds all the guests who attended this solemn event today. Then the priest seriously asked the bride if she swears that she will always love the groom in sorrow and joy, in wealth and poverty, in sickness and in health. Lady Arn glanced at the priest with a frightened look. She could not yet realize that right now her free life was ending, and what this terrible word, forever, meant. The young girl lowered her head and hesitated to answer. She began to wonder if it was okay to make a false oath before the altar. But she had no other choice, and she quietly said that she swears. The priest then asked the groom the same. Without a moment's hesitation, Cassian said clearly that he swears. He was pleased that Arnie also answered this question in the affirmative. As soon as the bride and groom confirmed their union with their consent, the priest said that after that they should seal their vows with a kiss. The young girl looked fearfully at the priest, and then at her husband. She had no idea that she would have to kiss a stranger in front of everyone present. But His Highness was not confused. He approached the young girl and carefully lifted the veil. Then he looked into her eyes, full of fear. His hand gently took her chin. His Highness quietly told his bride that if she wanted to escape, this was her last chance. But Arna looked at him sternly and said that he himself recently said that it was too late to run away. His blue eyes looked straight into her soul. He gently whispered that of course it was too late to run away. Then suddenly, his other hand wrapped around her waist and pulled her closer to him with a light movement. Arna's heart beat faster. She closed her eyes. After a few seconds, she felt his hot lips touching hers. She didn't know how to describe her feelings, but they certainly weren't disgusting. Everyone present in the hall began to applaud and joyfully congratulate the newlyweds on the birth of their new family. After the kiss, Arna's face was covered with red paint. The priest joyfully announced that from this moment on he was declaring Circassian, Duke of Ternugan, and Lady Arna husband and wife. Arnie's husband looked at his wife with satisfaction. A gentle smile appeared on his face. The young girl could not realize that all this was happening to her in reality. All the guests had fun for a long time and drank alcoholic beverages in honor of the husband and wife. The maids escorted the wife herself to her room. They told her that she needed to rest. The maids tired Arn very much because of their moderate care. They said she might fall because she had been out in high heels all evening. But Arn said in her mind that she would handle everything herself. When the dear young girl remembered her own wedding, the episode with their kiss immediately appeared in her head. This was the highlight of tonight's episode. Immediately after the memories, a blush appeared on her face again. She glanced out of the corner of her eye to see if the maids noticed, for she was not used to showing her weak points to strangers. Arnie was angry with herself for even thinking about that cursed kiss. She told herself to just forget about the kiss once and for all. After a few minutes, the young girl and the maids found themselves in front of the door to a room. The maids announced that they had come to the Duke's chambers. When Arna was inside and looked around, she thought that the room looked even better than she could have imagined. She immediately turned her attention to the large bed in the middle of the room. The young wife immediately fell on the bed. Today was an extremely stressful and difficult day, and her only desire at the moment was just to rest. She immediately began to wonder what was going on. Everything was like a dream for her. Arna could not understand whether she had done the right thing and whether she would not regret it in the future. She was brought back to reality by the maids closing the bedroom door and giggling merrily. They wished the young wife a good wedding night. In Arna's head, their words simply repeated themselves as terribly as possible. It finally dawned on her what exactly they meant. And it looks like one kiss won't end today. The young wife immediately decided that she could not just sit here like that, because she did not want to become known to everyone as a wife who killed her own husband on their first wedding night. At that moment, the only right decision for Arna seemed to be escape. She resolutely went to the window and opened it. The young girl surveyed the area and assessed how exactly she would need to go down. Arna decided that this was her way to retreat, and there was no more time to delay the decision. But just as Arna decided to take her first step towards escape, her husband's displeased voice was heard from behind. He sternly asked what she was doing there. Arna turned her head and looked into her husband's blue eyes. Here it was clear even to a dull person that his look did not predict anything good. The young wife was confused and did not know what to do, whether to quickly jump out of the window or to come up with something again and stay in her husband's bedroom. But it was only known that she was caught again. The young man saw that his wife hesitated and could not think of what to say to him. Therefore, he did not hesitate to repeat his question. Arna, standing on the windowsill of his bedroom, continued to decide what she should do. She had two options, either cut him down immediately or tell him the whole truth. Cassian repeated what she was going to do. Arna still decided to say that she just decided to get some fresh air, so she moved closer to the window. But her explanation did not look very convincing. Therefore, Cassian asked why she decided to breathe fresh air precisely on the windowsill and in the middle of the night. The young wife again began to mumble something that was not very clear, and Cassian asked if she was going to end her own life right now. Such a young girl could not even think. She looked at her husband and thought, what is he doing at all, and how did such a thing even come into his head? Arnie clearly answered that she was not going to do that at all. In her mind, she even wondered if it was possible to die by jumping from here. Cassian looked at his wife and decided not to continue this conversation, so as not to scare the girl, and she did not decide to do something else for the night watching. Arnie also decided to leave this little misunderstanding alone. After all, she couldn't tell him frankly that she was going to run away from him on their wedding night. His Highness cautiously began to approach his wife. He quietly took one step at a time, trying not to scare her even more. When he came almost close to her, he held out his hand to her. Arna looked at her and hesitated whether she should respond in kind or leave things as they were. But after thinking a little, she still decided to extend her hand to him. As soon as he took her hand, he carefully took the young wife from the windowsill. When Arna was right next to Cassian, he gently told her to never neglect her safety again. She silently looked into his eyes and only shook her head. She chaotically tried to think of what to do now, and nothing came to mind, except that I would have to spend the night with him. One thing she knew for sure was that if she had to do it today, then she would definitely become the wife who killed her husband on their first wedding night. Cassian's mind immediately had a picture of her nanny warning him to treat Lady Arna like a crystal because she was too weak. Even then, His Highness understood that he should be as careful as possible with his wife, but he did not think that her relatives had driven her to the point of suicide. When he looked into her eyes, Arna still hesitated as to what to do to her. She simply said that she was in such a stupid situation and thought that it was not too late to cut him down. He was silent for a while, carefully choosing the necessary words, and then turned to his wife. She looked fearfully at the young man. Then His Highness suddenly took his wife in his arms and carried her somewhere. He kept his eyes on his wife, and she also looked into his blue eyes. A blush appeared on Arna's cheeks from the very thoughts of what might happen when he brought her to bed. She didn't want to spend the night with a man she didn't even know. When Arna was in bed, her husband gently covered her with a blanket while she curled up, imagining what they would have to do now, and her heart almost stopped from those thoughts. She was waiting for her husband to start molesting her and did not know how she would be able to endure it. But when she opened her eyes, she saw Cassian standing next to her and said that she was very tired today. Confused, Arna looked at him with wide eyes and could not believe her ears. She asked herself whether it was possible to just sleep on the first wedding night. The young man leaned closer to his wife and whispered to her not to worry about anything, but to just close her eyes and get a good night's sleep. Cassian then turned and walked out of the bedroom. When Arn heard the door close, she was able to relax and breathe freely. Now was the time to reflect on everything that happened today. When she found herself alone with her thoughts, she thought that now everything was exactly as she wanted it to be. But it is somewhat strange that His Highness behaves with Arna as if with a child. For aristocrats, marriage was a common thing, a kind of simple tool, a union that pursued only one goal: family well-being. Therefore, everyone thought that this is exactly how the marriage of the Duke of Ternugensky is. She washed the bones of both the bride and the groom long before the ceremony itself. It was like this until everyone saw the young couple at the wedding. It was then that everyone noticed how His Highness looked at his wife and kept their eyes on the young couple, trying not to miss a single detail. But the absence of the young wife at half of the banquet, as well as the extraordinary care of the maids for the young wife, gave rise to too many rumors about the young girl herself. Even at the banquet, the guests began to whisper that missing their own wedding was too much. And it is very suspicious that the dukes are so protective of their new wife. The men quietly whispered the story that His Highness had personally chased away the men who spoke ill of the Duchess of Arna. Another asked in surprise whether it was true that His Highness had fallen in love at first sight. Rumors and misunderstanding of what was happening only grew. The new morning began when the young wife again climbed into her favorite tree and fell asleep there. She was not used to luxurious duvets, so she was much more comfortable here. Her husband watched her from his office. He could not fall in love with his beauty. But the thoughts of why she is doing this did not leave him. His assistant Alain entered the office. He also watched how his master couldn't take his eyes off his wife and thought, maybe all this talk about love at first sight is real. Cassian suddenly returned and told the aide that he had one question. He happily said that he would help if it was within his competence. But the question of His Highness simply knocked the ground out from under Alain's feet. He asked what it could mean if the wife wanted to commit suicide on the first wedding night. Alain thought a little and said that he did not quite understand, but could it not mean that a young girl does not want to be ringed to death? And Cassian replied that surely Alain was right. The assistant felt uncomfortable after such frank conversations, so he decided to change the conversation to another topic and announced that he almost forgot something important. Alain took some official letter from his pocket and said that yesterday the second prince had asked him to give the Duke an invitation. Cassian took the letter and asked Alain if Mackenzie had given him the letter and left immediately. And Alain confirmed that this was exactly the case. Alain asked the Duke when he planned to meet the Emperor. Cassian himself began to unfold the letter because he was very interested in what was so urgent about it. After reading the contents of the letter, Cassian placed it on the table and told the assistant that this meeting would take place very soon. Arnie and his nanny had breakfast outdoors. Sipping delicious tea, the young girl decided to contact her mother with the help of a magic sphere. Or rather, it was the latter's initiative. When the image of the Duchess appeared in the sphere, she had a mysterious smile on her face. She was silent for a long time because she did not know how to ask her daughter a delicate question. Arna directly if she liked the first wedding night? This question made Arna spit out all the tea in her mouth. You can't argue with the Duchess's tact. The Duchess saw her daughter's reaction and just laughed. Then the mother added that her daughter must have liked everything. Arna herself thought that she would smash that damn sphere to hell. Then the Duchess reported that there were rumors that her subordinates were thinking of mutiny. The Knights of the Golden Order went on strike so that Lady Arna could return to her homeland. This news greatly disturbed the young girl. She thought about her knights and repeated the word, strike. The Duchess confirmed that this is exactly what is happening. The mother also added that she had lost contact with some of the knights. She wanted to notify Arna earlier, but she did not get in touch. So the Emperor also began to worry about this. An upset Arna told her mother that if she didn't get in touch, it was necessary to tell everything to Sarno. But the mother said that the daughter herself said that she had not even seen him. Arna began to make excuses that she simply had a lot to do. Although in fact she was just in a bad mood, she was ashamed to even say such a thing, so she decided to lie a little. Arna's mood was already completely spoiled. She quickly put the cup of tea on the table and began to think about the strike that her knights had arranged. The young girl already imagined the chatter of her knights, who discussed her marriage and candidates for this position. If they fell into her hands now, then surely none of them would be spared. The conversation and thoughts of the young girl were distracted by the maid, who called her mistress. Arna turned her head and looked at what exactly she was called. The maid pointed to a whole pile of boxes and said that His Highness had sent her these gifts. The mother from the field said that it was very romantic, and Arna should definitely like it. But the young girl had her own explanation for such an act. Probably he really thought that she wanted to commit suicide. But while examining the boxes with gifts, Arna's gaze stopped at the green areas. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was hiding there. When she looked more closely, she really noticed a male figure there. And besides, she was very familiar to her. A minute later, a young man came out of the bushes and smiled happily at Arna. She only had time to think what kind of old man he had forgotten here. Arna was ready to kill this idiot immediately. After all, he should now be in the Western Empire. The young girl closed her eyes and wanted it all to be just a nightmare. She specifically did not invite him to the wedding so that no one would suspect that Arna is a knight. But when the young girl opened her eyes and once again looked at the young man, it became clear that it was not a dream. Across from her stood Crave. While the maid was merrily discussing gifts for Arna with her nanny, the young girl was quickly considering how she could drive this fool out of here without anyone noticing. While the woman was busy with an interesting conversation, Arna began to pour a little more tea into the cup and quietly shouted to the young man not to be a fool, but to quickly run away from here. But the young man only laughed in response and shouted that he did not want to leave here. After these words, Arna's patience ran out, and she shouted angrily as his tongue returned to say something against Arna. She was not going to tolerate that. The young girl clearly knew that for the coordinated action of the military, first of all, discipline was necessary. Therefore, she decided to teach such a disobedient man. The young girl decided to quickly get up and throw this fool far away from here. For all her troubles, there was not enough of it here. Then Arna felt an unpleasant chill down her back. She clearly knew that someone else was present. But she decided to deal with this later, because now it was necessary to expel Crave. That young girl was so focused on her knight that she forgot she was wearing a dress. It was quite uncomfortable to move around in it, so she got caught and felt like she was going to fall. She was already preparing to meet the ground, but suddenly she felt someone's strong hand grab her. Arna looked up and met those already familiar blue eyes. Cassian deftly picked up Arna and prevented her from falling to the ground. When his wife was rescued, he asked if she had killed herself. The young girl looked at her husband and decided that she did not think that someone was watching her. But just like last time, Arna did not feel that it was him. It was then that the young girl suspected that her husband was trained to hide his presence, because there was no other explanation for it. They continued to stand like that, holding each other's hands. At that moment, she thought that if her guesses were correct, then he must already have guessed that she was a swordsman. Arnie felt that he also possessed fighting skills. At that moment, the young man thought only that his wife looked like a cat whose fur stood on end. The man decided to change the conversation and asked his wife what she was doing here. The maids understood that they were superfluous here, so they all bowed and asked permission to leave the newlyweds alone. His Highness just nodded in response. When the maids left, Cassian looked at his wife and repeated the question. She thought a little and cheerfully said that it was nothing special. Then Arnie also cheerfully asked the Duke by what winds he ended up here. She decided to keep the conversation as believable as possible so that Cassian wouldn't notice Crave. His Highness asked Arna if she liked his gifts. Arna turned to the pile of boxes that she hadn't even looked at. She was, of course, ashamed, but she decided to think about it another time. The young wife cheerfully tapped the boxes and said that she liked everything very much. Of course, she couldn't play, but she tried her best. At that moment, Arna prayed only for one thing, that he would